Hey everyone, in our last episode, we introduced our guest, Kerry Smith, who is an accomplished CFO with a rich background in the tech and startup world. Kerry shared his journey from working at Ernst & Young to playing a really pivotal role in high growth up startups like JBoss, which grew from nearly zero to 17 million in revenue in just 2 years, ultimately being acquired by Red Hat for $370 million. He also helped scale Cloud Factory, securing significant funding in 2019 and growing the team to over 7,000 employees across multiple countries within the space of around 3 years. Kerry remains on the board at Cloud Factory now, but as we heard from Kerry in the last episode, he is now focused on his new venture, Sprout AI, a company building venture studio that aims to launch 8 startups over the next 3 years, leveraging AI to enhance human relationships and foster meaningful connections, while continuing to shape the future of tech-driven businesses. Our conversation highlighted the challenges of navigating rapid growth and how to focus on building strong financial foundations, and a company culture has been key to his success. We're really excited to welcome Kerry back to our podcast today. Thank you very much for joining us, Kerry, as we shift gears to talk about how entrepreneurs can best prepare for financial backing and what they need to know and do before seeking investment. So thank you very much for joining us, Kerry.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Jenny. And yeah, that was a long introduction, so we better get right at it. I would just say I think today's conversation is super relevant because I'm doing it again. You mentioned Sprout AI, my new venture, and we are in the early stages of fundraising. So hopefully a lot of what we talk about today will be something I can remind myself of as well.
That's great. Well, to kick things off, and before we dive into some of the details, what is the one misconception that you think that early stage founders have about preparing for financial backing?
Yeah, I wish I could boil it into just one. There's probably several. I think the biggest is probably the amount of time and effort it takes. The cool thing about most founders is that they're in love with their idea. And so they assume everyone else will be immediately in love with it as well. And then they get out there in the street asking for money and they find out, in fact, other people don't think it's as great as they do or don't see the same opportunity. So I think you have to be ready basically to go full-time fundraising. You can't really part-time fundraising. I think you have to be all in. You have to be very thorough. And, I just think certainly first-time builders, frequently don't recognize the amount of effort it will take to fundraise. I think repeat entrepreneurs kind of come in a little more prepared.
And I'm kind of going ad hoc here, but how do you see your role in supporting those founders through that process when you come in as a CFO?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, so first of all, in early stage, when you're talking early stage, it's pretty unusual to have a CFO. Typically it's going to be a founder who's probably tech savvy, had a great idea, or maybe they've got a partner who's tech savvy and they have the go-to-market piece, but it's typically not a CFO early on. And we can talk a little bit about some of the early investors versus later stage investing. CFOs
Mhm.
usually come a little bit later. I'd say maybe at the earliest seed round, maybe an A round. So it's really more about the entrepreneur early on.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to startups then, and the founder looking for financial backing, what are the top few financial metrics that investors really care about at that early stages from what you know and your experience?
Yeah, so I'm gonna change that a little bit, Jenny, because the reality is in early stage, it's not much about financial metrics. Because if you're talking about pre-seed or seed, there's not a whole lot of history there, right? So what you really have is a founder with an idea. In best case, maybe they're starting to get some traction. Usually they're not. So in early stage, investors are looking at the team, I would say first and foremost. Like, what's the level of commitment from the team, the motivation for the team? Do I think these guys can be successful? Have they had success before? I think that's huge. If they haven't, do they have, advisors or trusted people who can help them with that? Are they open-minded to that? And so, there's the typical stuff like what's the market opportunity, but there's a lot of things with great market opportunity, but I think early stage investors are going to be going, do I think this team is capable, motivated, committed
Mm.
be successful into that market opportunity.
That's really interesting. That is really interesting because it's, I suppose, and my thought process now is if you're a first time founder, how do you go about getting that advice and being able to put yourself in that best position? I know there are some fractional, very good fractional individuals out there at the moment, but if they don't have the funding and they don't have the money potentially, how would they go about doing that? I don't know whether you've got a comment on that.
Unfortunately, I probably have a comment on everything. I would say, yeah, it's if you're able to kind of just, maybe you have a friend. The thing about entrepreneurs is they're incredibly creative, working with constraints, and so, I mean, and if they've got a great idea they believe in, they'll go to the ends of the earth to help make it successful. So frequently they've got a friend or a contact who will offer some advice on, how to raise and how to present themselves and so forth. But first time, it's really hard. I mean, it's hard every time. I think first time more so, but I'd say the best entrepreneurs typically find people to help advise them, and I think a fractional CFO can help, but I would still say in the early stages, it's a little bit less about financials and more about team, market opportunity, and
Mm.
so forth. And Jenny, I don't know if you want to talk about later stage here now or later or in another episode, but it really is, early stage versus later stage is extremely different in terms of the fundraising
Mm.
process.
Let's look back on that a little bit later. Let's stay where we are at the moment. I think it's a really good idea. And I think you're right. I think for the first time founders and the entrepreneurs that are listening to this and watching this podcast, being and using those networks, which may or may not come naturally to the individual, depending on their personality type, they've got to be a little bit scrappy in the way that they go about how they do that and really, really just try different things to use that network and keep going. I'm sure by nature of the fact that they're an entrepreneur, they will do that. But networks are so important. I found that certainly, and I can see you nodding there as well.
For sure. Yes, that's right.
Okay. So one of the things that we find is that some entrepreneurs find building a financial forecast intimidating. From your experience, what is the best approach to creating one that stands out? And are there any common pitfalls that they might want to avoid?
Oh boy. Yeah. So, standing out, maybe not the exact right terminology, because I would almost describe it as credibility. Like I think like I had a saying at Cloud Factory, you probably heard me say it, which is that forecasts are always wrong, but sometimes useful. And I think that's a key thought, which is like you can build a financial model. It's going to be wrong, but I think what's most important is that it's believable and credible. And the way you make it believable and credible is you expose the levers or you expose the assumptions. So like how big is the market? How many clients you can sell? What's the price point? How many units? What's the cost? And all these components that you expose and hopefully can even create levers so the investors can go in, because what they'll do, they'll go in and they'll make their own assumptions. They're not going to believe your assumptions, or if they do, they're still going to go, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? And so if you can build a model that enables them to kind of pull the levers themselves and see what the result is, I think that ends up being the best, because then they can kind of model for themselves upsides and downsides. The reality is they're going to go build their own model anyway, based on their own market with their own assumptions. But I'd still say just be transparent with the model, and maybe paint a few scenarios. And I think it's great to have an upside scenario for most entrepreneurs. Their downside scenario is probably really the upside scenario. So I would say that's my experience. But have a few scenarios with changes in the assumptions and make it easier for them to model it. And to me, that's probably certainly early on, that's going to be something that's really helpful.
So, Kerry, as we think about with the founders and the entrepreneurs, as they think about moving to meeting with the investors that first time that they go and meet with them, let's extend the question now to just not just thinking about how they can be financially ready for that meeting, but all the other bits and pieces that you've been saying earlier on around the team and the individuals. How can they be fully ready for a level of scrutiny that they're going to face with those investors?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think the summary is just be thorough, be diligent. I mean, these are really smart people you're talking to. They will have done their homework, so you need to do your homework. And I think that means understanding who you're talking to, for example, and even like doing research about who you talk to, right? So you can't, it's not just about walking up and down Sand Hill and asking for money. There are investors that are going to be particularly aligned to your market opportunity, and you really want to target them. So it's a little more of a kind of a rifle sniper shot than it is casting a net. But I think the diligence will be you need to understand your market really well. You need to understand the product that you're building really well. You need to have conviction and commitment about why it's going to be successful. And I think if you have those things, a lot of people really focus a ton on the pitch deck, and the pitch deck is important, but I'd say it's only important as it's accompanied by, an entrepreneur who's well prepared, understands what they're selling, and can convey that articulately in words, through relationships with potential investors. It's not typically the pitch deck alone it's pretty rare that a pitch deck alone is going to, sell an investor.
Can you remember any investor meetings that you've been to where you kind of walked out and thought, I could have done that slightly better? Or
Oh, I can think of many. I would say probably most. To be honest, I mean, I think at Cloud Factory, we were, Mark and I were somewhat newbies in that space, and so we hit a ton of investors, particularly in Silicon Valley, and they saw Cloud Factory, saw the space we were in, so they were interested. So they took a meeting, and sometimes just getting a meeting successfully actually can take a lot of hard work, because they get a ton of pitch decks, and they can't possibly see them all. Um, but what we found was that we got a common message when we were, raising capital, and that was people don't scale. So we were talking to a lot of, VCs who had invested in software companies, and software scales. It's not people, it's bits and bytes. And, you can replicate that around the world for very low cost, and people don't scale. So we had a lot of unsuccessful meetings, and heard that a lot. But I think for us, every meeting we paid attention, we learned a lot. I mean, these venture capitalists actually they want you to succeed. They want you to succeed even if they don't invest in you. So they're typically very happy to offer advice, and even sometimes provide names of other venture capitalists who might be more aligned to what you're doing, because there are investors out there who are more okay with people in the
Mhm.
product versus not. And so I think that was a lesson for us, that we kind of quit casting a wide net and talking to all of these these traditional venture companies, and really honed in on the ones that were kind of more tech enabled and understood the people part and didn't require the same scale. And as you know, Mark was also a typical entrepreneur and contrarian, which is a lot of times the case with entrepreneurs. And so after all those meetings, of course, we came back and created t-shirts that said "We scale people," and leaned in on the whole people side of the business. And I think it actually helped how we thought about the business, and it even helped in our fundraising, because we could better articulate the opportunity even with people, because we were building a platform that did enable a bit more scaling of people than a traditional tech enabled business.
Mhm, mm. Articulating the opportunity, there's a good word, no, a phrase there, isn't there, in terms of how you really articulate it, particularly when you're dealing with founder entrepreneurs who sometimes struggle to do that and get the idea out. So let's move into the business plan area now, and thinking about how much or how important it is to have a detailed business plan at the early stage. And let's start looking at the different stages now, because how would you then change that as you're going through the different stages in terms of that business plan and articulating the opportunities you've just mentioned?
Yeah, I think a business plan is pretty important, but maybe not for the reason someone might, typically think it's important. To me, it's important, even at an early stage, that a founder has exercised the discipline to kind of write up a business plan, so that there's at least kind of this, potential path forward with the business. So I think it's important. It's not the most important thing, and I'd say probably what's most important about the business plan is how tightly it's held. I think entrepreneurs need to create a business plan, but then they need to recognize that it's going to change. And so they need to hold it loosely and they need to be willing to get feedback from the market, feedback from advisors, and be willing to change the business plan. It's a little bit like the financial model you were talking about, right? I mean, they're related. I think the business plan is very helpful, but you just can't adhere to it so tightly that you continue developing a product or taking a go-to-market motion that actually isn't going to be successful. So again, it helps frame your thinking, but I think you have to hold the business plan fairly loosely.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned again the work, the advisors now in terms of advisors for the entrepreneur as they're going through the different stages. At what point do you think it is essential that they should be speaking to an expert CFO? Um, where should they be thinking about that?
Yeah, I think certainly affordability is part of that, but certainly I think if you've got access to an experienced CFO, even at a at early stage pre-seed, reach out and talk to the person. Like I would tell you, for me, I actually have friends reach out fairly often who have an idea or start a company, and I love it. That's what I do, right? And so I'm completely happy just to have a talk like I'm having with you,
Mm,
to throw out ideas that they may or may not be thinking about. So I actually think access to that kind of capability is is going to be pretty easy for most founders. So I'd say get it going early on. I think as a company starts to have more traction and so forth, then you need to start thinking about having access to it more routinely, and kind of the concept of you get what you pay for. And so, starting to potentially, when you have the capital to start paying someone, I think it makes sense. Usually in a seed round, I would say it's not uncommon in a seed round, certainly in an A round, to have raised capital, and part of that capital is intended to bring on a CFO, particularly with a high growth company. Certainly the pace of growth and the complexity of the business, will impact how quickly you need a CFO and how, what level of experience and sophistication they need to have. If you're a
mm,
fast paced multinational company, then, with tax issues in many countries and so forth, you probably need someone sooner than later. If it's a simple business based in the U.S. with, only a U.S. client base, you can probably go a little longer. And then certainly getting a full-time CFO is going to be related to the capital you raise and all of those other factors.
mm. And that's a really good segue into the next question, really, because it's around the expertise to make sure that that company is ready to scale, whether it be scaling within one country or multiple countries. So let's talk tools now. And from your perspective, when you go and you look at a startup and you're coming in obviously at a certain point, what is it that you would want to expect to see that will allow you to really hit the ground running and do what you need to do to help that company scale in terms of financial tooling, software, or anything like that they should have really got going?
Yeah, to be honest, the level of sophistication with tools for startups is really low. And I would say there's really a low bar and low expectations. Like probably you would expect them to be using some simple software for accounting, whether it be QuickBooks or Xero. Those are two products that are, I think, extremely popular, and two that I've used with my startups, and they're really economical. And so you certainly expect that. And those products are already integrated with, other applications like Stripe for, customer payments, whether credit card or bank draft or something like that, transactions automatically tied to their banks. I mean, the most simple tools still bring up a pretty high degree of integration nowadays. So you can do a ton early on the cheap. So I would expect innovative entrepreneurs to have found someone to assist with that with really inexpensive software. Gusto's another one I've been using for payroll at Sprout, and I think it's really cool because it's really affordable, but it's actually they've integrated it with healthcare options. They've integrated it with other benefit plan options like 401ks in the U.S. And so for very little money, you have that level of integration. So I think most startups would have access to that and be looking at that sort of stuff. And then the final tool is probably like G Suite. Like I think it's probably still free for most startups, and you get Word documents and spreadsheets and presentations and Gmail. And so again, being frugal and using those types of tools, from my observation and even experience, that's what I would expect in most companies are using.
Mm. And it's good to hear actually that there are products out there that are going to save the founder time. Because 10 years ago, it would take up a lot more time of somebody, doing all of that. So, Kerry, you've mentioned that there are some great products now coming out, which will help founders to be able to much quicker and much more efficiently be able to run the business as well as focus on the product development side of it and keep that going. Striking the right balance, though, is key here. And so, from your experience, and making sure that any investor that invests in an organization, that their money is safe, not just in terms of the product that's being developed, but in terms of the governance. How do founders strike the right balance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the big answer would be founders typically don't. So the answer is if left to the founder alone, I would say it would be very unusual for them actually to give those types of issues the right amount of time. And that is where a CFO or a COO or someone with that kind of integration and governance mindset as a partner to them makes a ton of sense. I mean, it reminds me of something a guy told me like, I don't know, 30 years ago, early in my career. He said, from his perspective, there were three types of workers in the world. He called them finders, minders, and grinders. And the finders were the entrepreneurs, and they're all about the vision and inspiring people, but they can't be successful without the minders. And the minders are more the CFOs and the COOs, integrators who come in and can kind of help that entrepreneur achieve the vision. And that includes understanding what systems to use and making decisions about when to invest in the net, when to move from QuickBooks to NetSuite, for example. I've done that move several times. 2 decades ago, it was from, QuickBooks to like Great Plains or Navision or something like that. And so software continues to change and get more affordable, I would say. But yeah, I think founders typically don't. You need a COO or CFO or someone advising that has that experience to give consideration to governance, because it is important. It's pretty simple early on. And there's a lot of tools out there right now. We're using one called First Base that kind of where you can set up a company in Delaware, super cheap, super easy. It sends you the certificate of formation. It tracks a lot of that, the EIN, the employer identification number for the company. There's a lot of software now that does that for you. And so a lot of entrepreneurs will be able to do that. But as a company scales, that's where some of the governance becomes a little bit more important and even a little bit more brute force. And so I think having someone on your team, even if part-time or fractional, who kind of has that mindset is actually how I've seen, founders and companies achieve that versus just thinking that a founder will be able to do that on their own.
Mm. And listening to you speaking, that reminds me of that book, Rocket Fuel, in terms of that entrepreneur and integrator. So it's a good one to read, I think. And we talked earlier on about where you've not got it right when you've walked into an investor meeting. Now let's talk about where you have and you've come out thinking you've nailed it. So whether it's a story that you've done, an investor presentation that you've done, or you've heard a story from somebody else, what do you think in terms of when you have nailed something, what is it that's made you really stand out?
Yeah, I think you nail something, first when you find the right investor to talk to. So I don't want to minimize that. It's important that you're doing your homework behind the scenes to actually talk to the right investors. And then I think once you're able to get a meeting with someone who is probably the right investor in terms of investing in your space and, and aligned to your purpose and that sort of thing, then I think that the first thing is simply the way they relate to the founder. Like, and can the founder articulate the vision and the opportunity clearly in a way that resonates with them? I mean, I think hands down, that is the most important thing to having a successful meeting, and then you can kind of track through a pitch deck and that sort of thing. And, and you'll know based on the types of questions you're getting, whether you're onto something here or not, because first of all, if you're not getting any questions, then you can know you're not onto something. And then the type of questions will quickly make sense. And to be honest, my observation has been, I know we're having a successful meeting when there's this intuitive, organic conversation that occurs that's really about the market and the product and the team. And you can see the investor is really engaged. They've understood the vision you've articulated. And now they're actually kind of on your side of the table and almost plotting, how you can be successful there. And a lot of times you can learn a lot from those meetings because you may still have a meeting like that that's great. and you leave, and and then they ghost you or you hear nothing, and it
Mhm.
discourages you. But you can learn a lot because they'll ask really intelligent questions. They may probe on a particular part of your idea where kind of a light bulb goes. I've seen meetings where entrepreneur, there's been like a light bulb goes off and they actually make a little tweak in terms of either what they're building or how they're building it and that sort of thing. And so, I would say go to these meetings, not just, certainly don't go to them with the idea that you're just looking for capital, because that's not the case. You need to be looking for people who are going to be part of your team and bring wisdom and value and advice and experience that complements you, and even is willing to kind of, push back against your ideas, but also um, offer insight and perspective that will be really helpful to the business.
Mm.
Like for me, I would just say probably the best example of this for me was at JBoss. And JBoss kind of Series A round. And JBoss was a bit unusual in that there was a real competition to invest because people could see the idea and opportunity, and that's not always the case. But we ended up bringing in a guy named David Scott from Matrix Partners and Peter Fenton from Excel. I think Peter's at Benchmark now, and they put in 10 million bucks, but it actually wasn't the money that was most valuable. It was what they brought to Mark Fleury, who was the founder, in terms of wisdom. David Scott had built several software companies successfully in the past, knew how to go to market, and so I think really was the key person speaking into market about how do you take this JBoss idea, open source software, and make it successful. And so the capital was great. The wisdom, advice, guidance proactively was what made what helped JBoss be, I think, extremely successful.
That's really helpful. I think that's a really good tip there for those watching and listening to these podcasts to actually look at it in a different way, in terms of these investor meetings that you're having. I just want to turn I've got a couple more questions. And before I ask the final one, equity and valuation. Okay, this is a complex. I mean, I'm an investor and had shares in many companies. Equity and valuation, it's not just tricky for founders, it's tricky for everybody. So how should they be thinking about this in the early days, and what impact does it have when they're speaking to potential investors?
Yeah, that is a great question, and certainly one that founders wrestle with early on. Um, I think certainly repeat founders have a different perspective than first-time founders. For first-time founders, my advice typically would be, go as long as you can bootstrapping, but be aware of when additional capital might be helpful to either, if you're slow to market and you need to speed up, investing into R&D at an early stage, with capital might make sense. Um, and then I would say, certainly the amount of capital you need to raise for the idea is tied to the size of the market opportunity and your ability to raise capital. And so a lot of times first time founders don't have a network. It's their first time. And so their ability to raise a lot of capital is going to be challenged unless they can go find someone to come in and bring credibility that's done it before. Um, and then I would say it's just how much capital do you really need? And what are you going to use that capital for? What's the use of funds? And certainly early on, it's typically going to be about development. You may not even have a product that's ready yet. You may have a prototype. I will say there's a ton of tools out there now that that have really, really accelerated, AI tools in particular, that have accelerated the ability and reduced the resources necessary to build a prototype or an MVP.
Mm.
And it's a little bit of what's powering Sprout AI. Um, but then, there's probably some rules of thumb too that are easy to find if you just, go to Chat GPT or something. Like I would say typically in a pre-seed round, you're going to want to, you probably can't give up, less than 10% of your company to get a decent amount of capital. You definitely don't want to give up more than 25% early on. And so that, there's a relationship between how much the company you're willing to sell, how much money you need and why you need to use it, and then valuation, right? And so I think I will say this for big ideas, early investors, particularly venture capitalists, they actually typically aren't that worried about valuation. They're less worried about it probably than the founder. Because if they believe in the idea, the difference in a $10 million valuation versus 20 just isn't that big a deal in the scheme of things, if that makes sense. Because at the
Mm.
end of the day, if they believe in the idea and they think this is going to be $1 billion company, and they're getting in early, $10 million valuation, 20 million valuation just doesn't make that big a deal. So I would say for founders who believe they have that opportunity, hold firm, sell your idea, be committed, and and do everything you can to push the percent of the company lower, which indirectly pushes the valuation of the company or probably early stage the idea higher.
That's really good. Okay, thank you very much for that. And then the final question, a very quick one, as everyone's coming to the end of this podcast, is what are some of the biggest red flags that might turn investors off? And what can founders do to avoid falling into those traps?
Yeah. So this may be a little different answer than you're expecting, but maybe not. I think for sure lack of conviction, commitment, or motivation about what they're selling. I mean, if they sense any lack of commitment, it's done. It's over. I think arrogance can be a real turnoff. And I would say perceived laziness, like if they just haven't done their homework, they're not thorough, they're not prepared, done. Stubbornness, they sense that this is a person who's not going to be open to advice or changes or that kind of thing, done. Those are red flags. So the point here is simply the red flags are, I would say, on the softer side of the business opportunity. If they've got someone who they see is committed, motivated to this idea, and there's a real market opportunity, they're going to like it. And frankly, there's a tension because, you can also be, I would almost say you can also be too humble in a way that makes them think maybe you don't completely believe in the idea, or you're gonna be too willy-nilly and not a pushover. And so, they've learned their experience in knowing like what's that right point where like this person may even come across as arrogant because they have an idea that they believe in, but they sense that there'll still be enough softness to listen to ideas and change when necessary. And meaning that, like, that's what the best founders are. It's like they have a conviction about what they're building, how they're building it, why they're building it. I think is particularly true of like who I'm working with, Mark Sears, and I work great with those. Like that's who I work great with, is founders who are passionate about the why in what they're building. And I think when you have that, but someone who will still listen to other ideas and so forth, then you've kind of found the right alchemy. But it's rarely, I'd say there's not as many red flags relative to the pitch deck, the market opportunity, that kind of stuff. There's probably a few, but more yellow flags, because many times you can you can take the same idea, move to a different market and see success. And so I'd say those frequently would be more yellow flags. The red flags are about people. And maybe, I don't know how close we are to ending this podcast, but if there were kind of one overarching thing I'd say about fundraising, it's about people. It is not about your product. It is not about the market opportunity. Those are important, but they're secondary. It's about people and who you are, the people you want to work with, and building healthy relationships with those people where they can speak truth in your life, and they can tell you hard things and you can receive hard things. And if you can get that alchemy right, I think you'll have some great investors and be poised for great success.
And we are, Kerry, that's a really good point. We are going to be focusing one of our episodes on the people side of this. So I think we will keep that front and foremost in mind. One thing that you were saying in terms of how you build that influence over the investors and really, nail it in an investor meeting reminded me of a influence tool that we use at Giant. And that is that if you can think about, you can build trust and have influence, you do it over what we call the 4 C's: character, which you've mentioned already, chemistry, which obviously has to be there with an investor as well, competency, both in terms of the individual as well as the product and what's going to market, and credibility as well. So I think if people go into that with remembering the 4 C's, remembering the stories that you've just brought up today, hopefully they will do well. But thank you very much for joining us. I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode, and we look forward, Kerry, to having you back at some point. Keep tuned for more to come.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. It was great having this conversation.